Welcome to the Articulate Ox podcast. I am your host, Soma79. Thank you so much for joining me. This episode I am so excited about. I feel like I say that every time, but this was one of the ones that when I started this podcast, I really wanted to talk to this guy, Steve Levy, one of the founders of Moonshine Music, which to me was a tremendously influential techno record label, which through change of events totally changed my life, set me on a course that I was not on, and I was glad that I got on. And he is indirectly responsible for some of the most awesome things that have happened in my life, both socially, emotionally, artistically, all that stuff. The reason I was, besides all that, the reason that I was really excited to talk to Steve is that Moonshine Music, for me, one day just kind of disappeared, and I stopped seeing albums come out. This was the early 2000s, and there wasn't as much information about it. There weren't a lot of interviews, wasn't a lot of talk about it online, and I always wondered what happened to them. So every few years I would Google it, look for information, and I still found very little. So he was top of the list of people that I wanted to talk to kind of, thank him for what he had done for me, what his record label has done for me, and, just talk about the history of it and find out more information that I didn't know and just see what his perspective is as time has passed. And also just to find out what happened to it. Steve is a really interesting, very intelligent guy. He's had a long career in music marketing and in working with artists, and it was a very fascinating conversation, and meeting him did not disappoint at all. So thank you so much, Steve. I really appreciate you doing this interview, and thank you for everything you've done. All right, talk to you. Peace. Hey, welcome to the next episode of the Articulate Ox, with the current episode of the Articulate Ox podcast. I am your host, Soma79. I am so super excited for my guest today, Steve Levy, former CEO of Moonshine Music, one of the most influential techno record labels ever. How are you doing today, Steve?
Doing good. I don't know if I'd agree with your summary of Moonshine, but we definitely had some fun with it.
Yeah, we can get into all that. I mean, for me, just to give you a little backstory on why, it's so exciting for me to talk to you, is Moonshine really changed my life in a way that they were the first. I was a little late to the dance scene. I kind of just put my head down, and I graduated college, and I did it in like 3 years. And then I popped my head up and I was like, okay, now I need to figure out what social life is like. And the first thing I really found was dance music. And the first label I found was Moonshine. And pretty quickly was that every time I went back to, Newberry Comics or Tower Records around here, and I found another album with the Moonshine logo, I knew it was going to be awesome. And it always was. And then from there, I started going to parties, and there was a big show called, I think, Wish Upon a Star in Fitchburg, Mass, the Wallace Civic Center in 2001. And I went there and I met who would become the first love of my life. I met someone who would become a lifetime best friend, and also a person who would become my musical partner for basically executive produce my most recent album. This was 20 years ago. So without that show, I would not be artistically where I'm at. I wouldn't be, emotionally where I'm at. Without Moonshine, there wouldn't have been me going to that show. So that's why this is so important to me. So
amazing. Yep. I actually remember we did a Moonshine Overamerica tour show in Fitchburg in the ice rink.
That's the one. It was on this VHS. That was also the place I saw my very first concert, Smashing Pumpkins Siamese Dream Tour in 1994. So that place means a lot to me too. Yep.
Okay. Yeah. I remember there's a scene in I think it's in American Massive when they were talking, when we went in there, and our A&R guy at the time, John Grauman, he said, how cold is it? And he looks and he goes, it's fucking cold.
What's funny is I saw Soundgarden play there a few years before that, and it was so hot that night they had to open up all the doors, and basically anybody could come in because it was literally just too hot to have the door shut. So I guess that room goes both ways.
That's funny.
Yeah. So that was my introduction to raving. I mean, I think when you look at like the documentary you just mentioned, and when I just held up, you're looking at exactly people that looked just like me back in those days. And I was definitely late to the scene. I had the bleach blonde tips, I had all that stuff. I had the baggy UFOs, the kick pants. Now, but this was towards sort of the end of Moonshine. It was around till around 2004, 2005. So I missed a lot of the heyday. You took this from parties that you were throwing in an illegal casino and a fish market to basically touring all around the world. So what were your ambitions going into this, going into Moonshine?
Um, when I started, I mean, we Moonshine originally was a warehouse party that my brother and a college buddy of mine, George Safaris, started throwing probably in 1989. We were all in college together at Pepperdine University in Malibu through the mid 80s. And there we started throwing parties for the kids that went to Pepperdine at a bar called Trancas Bar and Grill. And kind of what it all started out was just having a good time, having a party, having a place for people to party. Music for me was important. I was always the kid with the cassette tape, kind of being the selector at the family parties, even when I was a kid. Um, and I was DJing some of our early stuff. I went back to the UK in 1988 when I graduated college, and that was happened to be kind of the summer of love, acid house. And I was right in the middle of it. Went to some of the warehouse raves, the illegal acid house parties. Went to Spectrum, which was kind of the one of the linchpins of the scene that Paul Oakenfold DJ'd at. Was bought my first Technics turntable. Um, then was collecting vinyl, collecting a lot of the music, and left England because the weather sucked, and came back to California. My brother was still here, my buddy George was still here, and they were throwing some parties and had moved into the city. And I started DJing at the parties with this stack of vinyl that I had, and it kind of started from there. But the ambition there at that time, there was no ambition. It was just that party, throw parties and have a good time. Yeah, I mean, we were making some money, but that wasn't really the important part.
Yeah, promotion is never guaranteed, success when it comes down to throwing on parties. It's like breaking even a lot of times is if you had a good time, that feels like a success. So I mean,
Yeah, yeah,
well,
yeah.
so I'm assuming at this point the scene over in the UK was more developed than the scene in the US. Am I correct in that assumption? I mean, were you kind of helping introduce people to a new type of dance music in the US, or was there already kind of a scene in the LA area?
There was nothing like acid house wasn't a thing. It was like there was a club scene, but it was actually more kind of velvet rope. Um, your name's not down, you're not coming in type thing. And there was kind of a little bit of a sea change happening. We were probably, there were a couple of people starting to promote nights with acid house music, but we were probably the first in LA. And I think, we definitely were among some of the first in the whole of the US.
Yeah, and I also noted here that you're one of the first dance companies to put out DVDs, which is obviously the visuals is such an important part of the entire rave techno experience. What led you to sort of go down that path and see that this was something that there was an opportunity for?
I mean, that's a big fast forward,
Yeah,
probably 10
sorry.
years.
We can get back to
But
that later if you want. It's just
yeah,
popped
no,
in my
no, no.
mind.
But I mean, it was just kind of like, you know, the beauty of what we were doing with Moonshine was once with the record label, once we kind of established it, was we had a real link into the UK scene and what was happening. We had an office in London because obviously I'm English. And so anything that was kind of new and exciting that was happening in the UK, which usually happened well before it was going to hit in the US, with respect to dance music and electronic music, we were in front of and on top of, and there were some crews that were beginning to um, become like visual DJs, VJs as it were, and we got connected with some people, and we were like, hey, I mean, it was the same, like no one had put out DJ mix albums until we did it, and we were like, hey, let's just test it, and that was how that happened.
It's interesting too, like the approach that you guys took, where essentially you're putting the DJ out front is something, now it's people go to parties if a celebrity is DJing, they don't even know what the person's going to play. But back then that was sort of a revolutionary idea that the DJ is really the personality. And this really struck me in watching, the American Massive documentary. At the end, there was some footage I'd never seen before of Frankie Bones, Keoki, and Micro in the back of a limo. And it
Yeah.
really struck you that how different, like just the way that especially Frankie Bones and Keoki, like the different patterns of their voice and just how different these human beings are. In a way, it almost struck me as like pro wrestlers. Like these guys are bigger than life and they're unique. And even if the criticism is the music all sounds the same, which I think is, BS, but people say that. You look at these guys and they couldn't be any more different.
Yeah, I mean, that was the putting the DJ as the artist was really a conscious decision when we did it. And no one at that point had been doing it. There was some compilations that had come out, and there were some compilations that had brand names, but they were, and the DJ mixing it was kind of the subline on it. And we were realizing that we could feel the groundswell, that there was kind of a movement out there, that people were seeing or wanted to see the DJs as an artist. So the idea of the DJ Mix album really put them at the forefront. And yeah, I think we pioneered it 100%.
So how did something like that work? Was it that you say you were talking to like a Micro or a Dave Ralph or someone like that? And is it like, hey, we want to do an album, just work on a set, find the one you want, gather the records, make sure that these people are okay with you using it. And then they just sort of, are they like working in their home studio to assemble something to send to you and remixing it? Or what's the process like?
It's funny you say talking to Dave Ralph, because I talk to Dave Ralph almost every day. So
Really? That Love Parade, I know it wasn't a Moonshine album, but that Love Parade album he put out, I must have listened to that a million times. I picked the CD up yesterday and it felt my heart like skip a beat.
okay, I'll tell him.
Appreciate it.
So how it started was, it was so there's two levels to it. There's like the legality of, like, how do you put together a mix album with a DJ, and you've got to license all of the music.
Things
So,
people are still trying to figure out today to some
well,
extent.
it's funny you say that, because and something I'll tell you a bit later in the story, remind me to kind of go back to Apple Music and
Okay.
the Moonshine Music DJ connection. But um, you know, what we figured out was that, there was a framework for how the creators get paid on an album when it comes out, and it's a percentage of the retail price. And typically for an artist album, particularly in the 90s, in America, an artist will get 12% of the retail price of the album, and that was their royalty. So with compilations, it was, you would sit there and go, okay, I'm going to put 10 tracks or 12 tracks on there, and then I'm going to prorate that number of tracks over to 12%. So you got 12 tracks, each track gets 1%. There wasn't any room for with that 12%, because typically whenever you'd license the music wanted, the labels we'd license it from wanted 12%, or prorated, a prorated amount of that 12%. So we said, you know what, we've got room to pay out 15%. And so we said, okay, the DJ gets 3% as the creator of the mix, and then we apply the other 12% to the royalties that we have to pay to the licensees. So that was that side, coming up with that. And then the other side of it was, we would go to the DJs, we'd say, we want you to do a mix album. You've got creative control. The only limit for your creative control is the tracks that we can legally license to put on your album. So give us 20 or 30 tracks that you want to build a mix with, and we're going to go out and see what we can clear. And then we would come back, and usually, if they gave us 30, we'd probably come back with 20 that we got cleared. And then they would either work in our studio at Moonshine, we had a studio, and work with our engineers, or work with one of their own engineers, or work on their own and deliver us a mix that typically, would just maybe require a little bit of cleaning up here and there in Pro Tools. And that was the process. But the creative control for the mix was 100% with the DJ. because it would have been ridiculous for us to sit there and go, oh no, you got to do it this way, you got to do it this way. Same down to most of the concepts that the DJs that our DJ mixes were pretty much led by the DJs. I mean, we had some series of albums on Moonshine that we'd created, and we would slot some DJs into them. I mean, an example would be like Psychotrance. We established that series. Then a DJ named Defuse was a guy I met out of when we were on tour for Moonshine Overamerica. Funny story was he picked us up at the airport to take us to our show, and he's this super likable guy, and he was the opening DJ for the night because he worked with the promoter, and he handed me a CDR of a mix, and I took it, and I think it sat on top of my TV at home for about 4 or 5 months. And finally, at some point, I picked it up and I listened to it, and I was like, "Oh, this guy's great." And we were like, but how do we launch him? He comes out of Texas. He hasn't done anything really nationally, so we slotted him on Psychotrance and built him from there. But typically, someone like the Micro Tech Mix, that was his concept. The artwork was stuff that he worked with our designers to create.
Yeah, that too was one of my I believe you're referring to this record.
Yep.
One of my all-time favorites. This was one of the first ones that really I just played to death. And like I remember just sitting in my bedroom being like, what the hell? Get me to wherever they're playing this. As I open this is one thing that I was looking at these pamphlets, because I throw nothing away from back in the day. You guys were selling cassettes, which I guess because you're big in the 90s, that makes sense. But the idea of a techno cassette to me kind of blows my mind. It feels like the most lo-fi way to listen to like the most hi-fi music. Was that a big part of your business back in the 90s?
I would say 25%, when people were still listening to cassettes and using them. I mean, the mid 90s, almost not every car came with a CD player. Like it probably wasn't until late mid 90s that a CD player was not an option. So there was definitely a cassette business. I would say probably our split was not the same as like a regular record label playing, selling rock or pop music. It was probably less. We were probably more CD driven. But yeah, I mean, it's crazy. You just reminded me about cassettes. I wasn't, really.
They're forgettable.
Yeah. Although I'm hearing there's a comeback. So
they are. I mean, I got a couple like Eric B and Rakim sitting right here. I was listening to this the other day on cassette. It's the only medium I have this on. So I'd rather listen to that than streaming a lot of the times. But
that's funny.
So one thing I read, and I believe it was an interview that you did with Billboard with your brother years ago, was that you guys were really businessmen that got into the electronic music world, as opposed to electronic music producers who decided to be businessmen. So
the actual quote, and that's my quote, because I've probably used it more recently as well, is that we were businessmen who went into music. We were not musicians who went into business. And I think I've seen a lot of disasters happen with the latter. I don't know that necessarily. I mean, calling myself a businessman might have been a stretch in the 90s. I like to think I might have a little bit more knowledge nowadays, but
it might have just been compared to the people around you.
What's that?
Might have just been compared to the people around you, that you were the most businessman of them.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was, and even with, you talked about promoting clubs and breaking even, and I never considered that a success. Like I came out of school. I've always been kind of entrepreneurial, even when I was in college and earlier, like even just like doing shit like detailing cars to make money and shit like that. So I've always been driven by like I got to make some money from it, and I actually was a fairly successful promoter pretty young. But then I also had like a couple of big duds where, I mean, there was one party I did which was really the reason I got out of promoting. I lost a ton of money on one night because it rained, which in LA, does cause parties not to happen. And I was like, I really don't want to fucking do this for the rest of my life. And that was when I decided I got to kind of pull back from that. Took a breather. At the time I was getting into some graphic design, I bought myself a Apple Mac 2, and I was doing flyer design for other parties, and that was when the Moonshine label thing started. So I think the money that I lost on that one night was the same amount that was invested in launching Moonshine, and it was definitely a better value proposition, so, and
So
better investment.
when you go from throwing parties in like the local LA area to launching a label that has an international reach, it'll grow to have an international reach. I guess it starts with one if you're also based out of London. What are those steps like? How do you start getting the word about Moonshine out from outside the West Hollywood area?
I mean, it started. My original partner in Moonshine was a guy who had been working. He was also the same age. We were early 20s. He was someone I knew from the club scene, and he had actually been working at Capitol Records. So he had a vague understanding of the music business. Whereas my part of it initially was that I knew the music, the electronic music, and I had the connections, because a lot of kind of UK guys and guys had come through some of my clubs. I had a club called Truth here for a couple of years in LA that was kind of a real linchpin of the original like rave scene here. And so I knew Paul Oakenfold through that. I knew some other UK guys like Trevor Fung. And when we started the original version of Moonshine, I reached out to them and they connected with me with people in the scene in the UK. And we had kind of a direct line, and we were able to license music that no one else was really getting their arms around. And because we were running one of the kind of hottest, or I was running one of the hottest clubs in LA with the most progressive music, I was DJing. I also knew the music. So, it was absolutely legitimate. And that was kind of how we were able to do it. And then as far as like figuring out how to get the word out, it was just kind of, we just experimented. And we were there. We started when kind of the internet started getting started. And we had a friend, my brother and I, who buddy of ours who we used to go out with all the time, and he disappeared. And I'm talking about like probably 93. And then suddenly he reappeared. His name was Charles. And he's like, guys, I found this thing. It's called the internet. And you laugh, right? Because you probably don't know life without it, right? And
well, it's funny because I didn't have the internet till 97. So I remember 94. I would have been like, what?
Yeah. And he was like, I found this thing called the internet. And we're like, oh yeah, what's that? And he's like, and there's these things
series
called
of tubes.
It's just like there's these things called websites, and they're like catalogs online, and then there's these boards. You should check out these boards like out dot, or there was like out dot raves, and he's like, and I convinced AT&T to give me a T1 line into my apartment, and I've been building websites, and I'm like, what the fuck is all of that? And he's like, I want to build you a website. And we said, sure. So we were literally one of the first labels to actually have a website, because
it was like 94. I think it was when you guys, that's
like
pretty crazy.
And what Charles did was and the reason he wanted to build us a website was because he wanted to take the website, and he took it to Capitol Records and showed them it. And they contracted him to build the first like major label website, which was the Megadeth website.
Dave Mustaine.
And it was funny because I remember he had gone into the meeting and he called us after. He's like, they want me to build the website. What do you think I should charge them? They asked me how much it would cost. And we were like, well, it's freaking major labels. Like you could probably get $100,000, but ask for 90. It sounds better.
Yeah. Sounds like you really put a lot of thought into it.
Yeah. And they agreed to it. And he launched a business that, became very successful in kind of web development way back when. But so we leveraged that. We leveraged email. I mean, we've always been, from my club promoting days, the your most valuable asset as a club promoter was your not your emails, your mailing list.
Right.
I always used to have, like, pretty young girls wandering around with clipboards taking everyone's name and address, and that was how I was successful as a club promoter. And you kind of just leverage the same kind of marketing. And then as a promoter, we're always coming up with, cool new marketing ideas and campaigns and names and brands and all that kind of stuff. And it just rolled into it. And also, I had good people join Moonshine, come work for us. But we were really making up a lot of it as we went.
Yeah, and it seems like you were a few steps ahead of the game too, because you said there were no websites back then. There wasn't a whole lot of middlemen between you and the customer, which I think you see a lot in major label. There's a lot of middlemen between the customer and the artist, and there's a lot of people filtering it. But when you take those people out and you have more control over, giving the people what they want, it gives you a ton of power.
Yeah, and it was just purely because we were authentic. We came from the scene. We weren't someone who came in and go, "Oh, what's this electronic music stuff? We need to, like, jack into it." We were part of it. So I think, people like you smell that. You smell whether or not we're authentic. And by the same token, we were doing a lot of stuff in the background just to pull the whole thing along as well, grow it. A lot of, like, guys that kind of worked with me on my club spread around the country and started promoting in other cities. So that was happening. Fast forwarding a little bit, like 97, we were trying to figure out how to tour our artists and tour the Moonshine brand. And we couldn't get arrested with the current booking agencies that were around. And I got connected with this guy, Paul Morris, who had an agency called AM Only. And he was kind of like a young guy. He had a store in the East Village called Breakbeat Science that was it was drum and bass specialty store. His partner was Dara, and Diesel Boy, I think, was involved. And Paul, another English guy, I knew him. I'd met him kind of a couple of years earlier because one of his best friends growing up was a guy by the name of Richard Russell, who ran XL Recordings, and I worked with XL Prodigy, right? And anyway, Paul started this booking agency, and I worked with him and his artists, and we kind of fed each other. Like, if I sign an artist, I'd say, "Oh, you got to go work with Paul." And if he signed an artist, he'd say, "You got to go work with Steve." And we put together this kind of very, like, limited circuit of promoters that he was working with around the country for the first Moonshine Over America tour. And that tour was, like, the first year was like 14 dates, and we flew it. And then it grew for the next 5 years to, like, close to 30 dates. We were on a rock and roll tour bus. We were doing some shows in some markets with 25,000 people showing up. And but we built that. It wasn't there. So, but we did it kind of out of necessity and DIY.
You sort of inferred this a little bit, but you really have to take a counterculture grassroots approach with that, because you're not going to run an ad on television for a show like this. You're not going to run an ad in, like, the local newspaper or anything like that. You have to somehow get the word out to the right people and get them at this place. And I thought you show on the American Massive, they showed one of the cut scenes that, like, they were at a place where there was no one there, where it was like these same artists playing in front of 25,000 people at one city. And then sometimes you show up and there's no one there. And I've been to shows like that where you're just like, where is everybody that was here last week? And it's kind of tough to figure that out. But were there a lot of growing pains in terms of touring? Like I imagine trying to book a college hockey rink in Fitchburg, Massachusetts from the other side of the country means that you've gone through a lot of other options. Like, what was that like?
Well, no, that was kind of Paul's job on AM Only. And at that point, I think, Paul was, what year was that? Was that like you said 2001,
The
right?
one I was at 2001, but I know the one on
Right.
the American Massive was I think 99 or 2000.
No, if it was American Massive, it would have been 2001.
Oh, maybe the
Yeah,
one I watched that was at because it looks so familiar,
yeah,
and I was like,
yeah.
everybody looks the
No,
same
because
there.
I think that was the only, because previously in Boston, we always played Avalon on a weeknight.
I went to a lot of those
Yeah.
shows.
So and so we did that Fitchburg one. I mean, the as kind of, first of all, we had data on like where we were selling records, because that was actually sound scanned, and every week we would know what markets were selling records, how many records were selling a week. So
And selling through the website, where you're shipping them to. That's where you're a
yeah,
little ahead of the game.
that was, I would say, less of a data point for us, but we had we knew where there were markets where, and it was interesting because we would go into markets, or we would be telling the promoter, look, we sell shit tons of records here, and they'd be like, really? And we're like, yeah. And when we would do like a Tuesday night show in like Pittsburgh, um with Carl Cox, it would be rammed. It would be 500-600 people in a club that only held 400, and they'd be begging for more at 2 o'clock in
Right.
the morning. But the promoter was usually like, "Well, I don't believe it," because we didn't. None of these shows were pre-sold tickets or anything like that at the time. It was like you're sitting there waiting for people to show up.
Yeah. It was a challenge to buy tickets back in the day. Like I pulled out some of my old flyers. So this is one of the ones that a similar show from the Wallace Civic Center. And there's a whole dissertation on the back of like how to buy tickets, how not to
Yeah,
buy
yeah,
them, who you can
yeah,
call. Like then all the directions and the address will be released the week before. It's like there's a picture of the hockey rink, so that doesn't make it very easy. But
yeah.
like there was a big pain. Like it was hard to get tickets ahead of time for a lot of these shows. I remember having to drive to Boston to get tickets for a show in Springfield, and that was the only place I could buy them. Like that makes a lot of sense. But
Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, it was funny because, I mean, you probably know I went into Insomniac, as head of marketing a few years ago, and there was still a little bit of a mindset in there of like selling tickets through record stores. It was, because that's how it was
right,
done. It was kind of funny. They had not kind of got their head around, like, well, I went in there and I'm like, you're an e-commerce business.
right,
Like, and it was like, oh yeah, you're right.
yeah. Do it online. You can put all these service charges on, and people have no one to yell to. They can just yell at themselves about it.
Yeah.
But so another thing I noticed, there's a lot. Herb magazine, one of my favorite magazines of all time, which recently now is working on some sort of a comeback. I was chatting with someone a little bit online about it. You see your logo a lot in this magazine, a lot of ads, a lot of different stuff. Did you guys have a pretty close relationship with Herb, and did Herb help you guys grow to some degree, or?
Yeah. So funny story. So Raymond Roker, who was the founder of Herb, I was throwing a party. I mean, it was probably like 91, 92, and it was a party I did at this, at a roller rink. Was it a roller rink? Yeah, I think it was a roller rink in kind of like downtown LA. And I was up on stage with the DJ and I was chatting. This guy came up to me and he's like, "My name's Raymond, and I've just launched this magazine. It's called Herb Magazine." He handed me the first issue, and it was printed on newsprint, and he's like, "I really really love you to check this out." And I remember I checked it out, and I was reading it, and you probably don't remember this, but it's kind of a long time ago. Magazines in America always used to like start an article at the front and then finish them at the back. It
Mhm.
was like this weird thing, like coming from England where there was a big magazine culture, and I've always been a big magazine hound. I never understood that. And the first thing I remember, the first thing I said to him when he called me up and he was asking, what I thought, I was like, "Well, why do you do that?" And he's like, "Well, because everyone does that. All the big magazines do that." And I go, "Well, it's so annoying,
Right.
and it makes no sense." And literally that issue onwards, he stopped doing it. And so I had
Thank
I
you.
knew Raymond, and And he, he was a big supporter of kind of when there was still a club scene. I was still doing clubs. But when we launched Moonshine, one of the things that we did was we made a real conscious effort to spend a lot of money on marketing where we knew that our audience was. And our audience was with the zines. And Herb was one of the kind of big ones, particularly on the West Coast. And if you look back at that time, pretty much any magazine that was predominantly electronic music, we owned the back page, and we did that kind of consciously and constantly. So we supported them; they supported us. And
That's probably the branding that got me, to be honest with you, because I do remember that Herb was landing on my radar before techno was in general. So it's probably from me reading Herb and seeing your logo over and over again that got me to go to the store and buy that and started me on my whole journey.
Yeah, great. I mean,
This is one of my favorite.
and
Herb's one of my favorite magazines of all time. I'm glad they're trying to do something again. But
then behind you got BPM. I mean, I don't know
yep.
if you know. I mean,
That was a coincidence. I know that's usually facing the other way because the Public Enemy one on the other side, and I was like, oh yeah, same guy.
Yeah, so we ended up, when we launched DJMixed.com, we were kind of scratching our head. We were like, well, we need content and we need ad sales. And we knew David Island, who was one of the founders of BPM. And also we used to support them. We used to spend a lot of money advertising with them. And we were kind of like, he was a very aggressive publisher in making sure we were always advertising with him. We were like, you interested in selling the magazine and joining what we're doing here? And that's how we got involved with that.
So I have an interesting piece of one of a kind moonshine related history here that I'll share with you related to Herb. So back to that story I told you before about the first time I went to that show. I think it was Wish Upon a Star in Fitchburg in 2001. Christopher Lawrence was one of the DJs there. And I was there with a family member, and we both had T-shirts, and it had listed all the DJs in the back, and one of them was Christopher Lawrence. So smash cut to a year or so forward, the family member that I went with is now living in LA, and they're at the post office, and they're wearing the T-shirt, and they hear a British woman behind them going, "Christopher, that's your name. Christopher, that's your name," or something like that. And he turns around, and it's Christopher Lawrence and his wife. And he was like,
she's
"Oh, wow."
Australian, actually. So.
Okay,
Yeah.
cool. And so he was like, "Oh, we told him, like, we're fans, my brother especially, he's a big fan." And he got him to sign a postal slip for me, because it's the post office. So then this family member is reading Herb magazine, and they come upon this article with Christopher Lawrence. It's kind of tough to see with a reflection, but they talk to his wife here, and it says The Secret Life of Christopher Lawrence, and she says, his favorite thing to do to go to the post office to collect his daily records, this daily deluge of promo records. It's like Christmas for him every day. So this person got me this article framed with the signed postal slip. So it's an autograph of Christopher Lawrence from the place that is, according to him, his favorite place to go. So
that's funny.
I've been carrying this around for like 20 years.
Another great Christopher Lawrence autograph story.
Yeah.
On Moonshine Overamerica, I can't remember where. Christopher had just put out an album with us, and a kid came up to him with a CDR of a burn of the album. And this was when CDRs were becoming a problem for us.
Right.
And he comes up and he goes, "Hey, Christopher, will you sign this? This is a CDR of your..." And Christopher was just like, "Fuck no. Like, go out and buy the fucking record."
I bought mine.
Yeah, it was probably that album, but it was yes, that was a funny story.
So that's an interesting transition too, because so you guys, one of the reasons I wanted you on here and to talk to you is that because when you guys sort of disappeared, I noticed, and I'm across the country, the internet isn't as strong as it was, and I remember Googling a lot trying to figure out what really happened to Moonshine Music, because it felt like one day they were just suddenly gone. And there was very few information. There's a timeline article that pops up on Billboard, I think. And then there's that interview you guys did at Billboard, but there isn't a whole lot of press about it. So I've been wondering for years, what was it that really led to the end of Moonshine? And was it as sudden as it felt like to someone like myself?
I mean, it was basically the curse of Billboard. Whenever Billboard does a profile on a label, they die.
Really?
No. Um, it's a it's a long so no, it wasn't sudden. Um, although it happened fast, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And probably faster than we all saw it coming. Look, it wasn't, it wasn't just us. It was like the whole physical um record business took a kick in the nuts around 2000 to 2003. And it a lot of people were like, oh, it was streaming, it was down, well, it wasn't streaming, it was downloads, it was I would argue partially piracy from the CDRs.
Mhm.
um, and then it really, the killer for the music business as a whole was the fact that retail collapsed. Um,
Right.
and that retail collapse really started with September 11th.
Mhm.
And I remember Dave O'Day, who was on our label, who
Yep.
was kind of our house engineer, and a good friend of mine also that we
Whose
worked
name I
with.
just found out I've been saying wrong for 20 years. I thought it was odd. So I thought it
Yeah,
was Dave
well,
Odd.
he's O'Day. Um, about, I want to say, like 10 till 7 in the morning. No, it was 10 till 6 in the morning. uh, Called me and my phone rang and I picked up the phone. I'm like, what's going on? It was Dave. And he's like, switch the TV on. And I was like, I'm thinking, oh, there's something about rave on TV on the news or
Yeah.
something. Switch the TV on and there's, the Twin Towers and the planes smashed into them. And the crazy story is that Dave's sister-in-law, who was married to the woman who was married to his brother, worked for the one of the stockbrokers that had two floors. I'm trying to remember the name of the company, and she lived on the West Coast, and she was on a conference call when the first plane hit, and kind of basically went through the conference room that she was on a
Wow.
conference call with. And so obviously he
Mhm.
gets the call, I get the call, we're looking at this, we're looking at this whole disaster going on. And not to kind of downplay what a disaster was, but I remember sitting looking at my wife and saying, this is going to have such a bigger effect than just those buildings going down and these people dying. This is going to be much bigger than that. And really what it did was it crippled the US economy, but kind of did it in slow motion, because immediately afterwards, you're in the Northeast, you probably remember, like, all your shopping malls were, shut down, people evacuated, there were bomb scares, there were threats, and this
Yep.
this went on for like that whole Q3, Q4 of that year. And the Northeast is the biggest retail market in the country. And Q3 and Q4 is when 40% of annual sales are made. And so the knock-on effect was, especially for record retail, was like a bunch of chains went bankrupt. And in with respect, and it wasn't just in music, there were also, fashion chains and stuff like that that also suffered bankruptcy in the next couple of over the course of the next couple of years. And the trouble with the record business is that the music business, CDs, was sale and return. So if a retailer didn't sell our CD, they could send it back to us, and we would have to pay them the money back. And the cash flow of the business is that, we worked with a distributor who sold to the major chains. We sold, I think we sold the CDs for like $9, and then they retail for like 15 or something. What happened when was that, and I remember that morning we had just shipped one of our biggest albums ever. We had a mix album with Mixmaster Mike of the Beastie Boys.
Is it
And
Spin Cycle right here? I
exactly.
was going to bring
and
this up too because I was curious how that happened.
and we had shipped something like 50,000 units, which was like one of our biggest ship outs. And Mike was supposed to be on MTV that morning to promote the album. Obviously, that didn't happen. And then the other album we shipped, Micro Tech Mix #2, which was also a huge album for the Northeast. Um, so those, obviously those albums failed. And the knock-on effect. And then what happened was when all the retailers went bankrupt, they were all bought out, their assets were bought out of bankruptcy. And not a lot of people understand this. When the one of the reasons that, you know, some of the hedge funds and the private equity groups that bought these assets out of bankruptcy, the value of them was like every single CD that was sitting in the warehouse, in warehouse records or in Newbury Comics or whatever, was worth $8 because they got to ship them back to the distributor, who then shipped it back to credited the label. So
Adds up
basically
fast.
what happened to us was we were rolling along, we had a bunch of sales, and then a year and a half later, we suddenly get a bill over the course of a few months. A bunch of the different chains had been bought out of bankruptcy, and then we getting all the returns. And so, whereas we were probably, doing like, anywhere from $500,000 to $1 million a month in sales, suddenly we weren't getting paid for those sales because we had to apply a credit from stuff that we'd sold 2 years earlier. And it wasn't just us. I mean, we were, I think, 0.11% of market share for the whole record business, when we were at our peak. That was why all the major labels almost failed. They fired everyone. They stopped making CDs. And that's what fucked the music business. And we, as a privately held independent company, we just couldn't weather it. And so, we went from having like 35 people working for us and having to make very difficult decisions to let people go. And we probably should have done it a lot faster than we did. And maybe, but we never shut down the company, never shut down the label. We just stopped selling CDs. And, the catalog has been out there, and you can still listen to Moonshine stuff, not the mix albums, but you can still listen to Moonshine stuff on Spotify and everything. But and then for me personally, I lost interest. Mm-hmm. It was a pretty devastating time, and we were fortunate in that we had some other interest in other stuff that we were able to kind of like step away. We had BPM, and we were growing a publishing company at the time. And, maybe to my detriment, maybe I should have stayed in it and try to figure out, where was the music going? But I just lost interest, and I went and pursued other interests. I was big into motorsports. I got involved in a bunch of stuff around that for several years, managing some race drivers and stuff like that. But it wasn't quick, it wasn't like overnight. It was a process, but that's what happened.
It's funny for me. So I was very into that music all those years. When it sort of went away with Moonshine, I sort of drifted away, and I got way back into hip hop again. And then I became a performer. I used to do shows around Boston, but then hip hop fell off that same cliff around 2006 or 7, where it was just like, oh, there's way too much product out there. It's rappers trying to sell to other rappers, and the scene just fell off a cliff, and a lot of artists disappeared and never came back.
But there was another thing that happened, which is also kind of a contributing factor for us. And again, and it was, our current president, who I must say I do like. I mean, some people don't, but I do. I think
I like him better than the last one.
And I voted for him despite the fact that he launched the Anti-Rave Act in 2000.
Right. I actually found a letter. I wrote a letter to Kerry, the governor, the senator from Massachusetts, who John Kerry ran for president. I read a letter to him about that, and I actually got one in response that I couldn't find today. But I wrote him pissed off about the Rave Act, and they actually wrote me back.
So there was also that happened, and that was 2001-ish. And I remember when we did Moonshine Overamerica.
And this too, if you can find it, is a great article that talks about a lot of that stuff, about all the different arrests during the period, how they tried to enact the crack house law to essentially treat raves like crack house. This is a really good article if you can track it down. So it's
So what also happened was like the rave scene, because I remember 2000 Moonshine Overamerica was like this crazy banner year. We for me it was great because I got to go do a lap of America, two of us. So really got to kind of connect with what was going on.
Looked like a blast too. Check out that documentary. It's floating around YouTube.
Yeah, it's actually on YouTube. Yeah.
Or send you $1.99 on by 2000. You can get a VHS of it. According to one of the flyers, they fell out of one of these.
Good luck.
Yeah.
So what also happened was 2000, it was rocking. I remember going around and doing the same lap in 2001 when all of this was happening, and it was just a different kind of feeling out there, and we were like, this is really getting impacted. And essentially also what happened was there was this big flip from rave music in clubs to the whole kind of there was a switch to open format and bottle service. And so that killed
It doesn't.
the
Yeah.
the live side of rave music at the same time as when the actual the physical record market was going away. And there was a real drought, but a lot of the booking agents that were solely focused on the US. I mean, Donnie went underground. Disco Donnie, who was the focus of
Yep.
the Anti-Rave Act and these crack house stuff.
That Rise
Donnie,
documentary, I think it was
again,
called.
another guy I talk to very regularly. Still talk to him.
Wow.
It was funny because he posted a thing in stories. I think it was even for not for UBW, for Sunset Music Festival about a week ago, with Biden, like a Biden head in it. And I was like, I DM'd him and I'm like, I don't think any of the kids are really going to get the inside joke here,
Yeah. I know.
And he's like, you're right.
Yeah.
But that happened as well. And I remember, we published BPM magazine. I remember around 2006, 2007, because we were really just covering like open format. We covered the rise of guys like AM and Aoki when he was open format, and Mark Ronson and stuff like that, because that was what was going on in the club scene here in LA and around the country, and Vegas as well. There was the kind of the rising of the club scene in Vegas, but it wasn't electronic music. But I remember Rob Seamus, who was the editor of BPM, kind of coming to me probably around 2007. He's like, Pasquale's throwing some shows again out in San Bernardino, and it's like a rave scene, like really kind of popping back up. And there's all these kids wearing neon and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, well, we should cover it. And he's like, no, it's just not cool. And I'm like, no, we should cover it. Anyway, we didn't back then. But there was a drought. It went away. The whole thing went away for about 6-7 years. I think the other side of that is that the clubs didn't want ravers in the clubs because they didn't drink.
Yeah.
And when the bottle service and hip hop and open format and thing kind of kicked up, there was no reason to have a rave DJ in the room and a bunch of ravers show up on a Thursday night.
Yeah.
And that started happening around 2003-ish, and was definitely the death of it. It went away until started bubbling here in LA 2007, 2008. Hard started throwing their parties and in downtown LA, and the kind of Insomniac parties started getting bigger. And then 08, 09 EDC at the Coliseum, and the sports arena here in LA started getting some momentum. And obviously that got killed in 2010 when the girl died there, and I actually went to that show.
Yeah, that's how fast things that can happen. That was rumored to happen in our scene as well. I don't know if it was true or not, but
yeah, I mean, but then EDM blew up,
right.
But there was a break. There was 6-7 years where like electronic music couldn't get arrested.
Yep. So I don't want to eat up too much of your time, but I had a few other while I have a few other releases that you guys put out that I was hoping you might have some thoughts on. This one in particular, Kyoki Jealousy, was a huge one for me. I remember seeing him at Lupo's, and it was like a pretty half-full show. It was right around the time this came out, and I just absolutely loved it. And one thing that really interests me in looking through the liner notes in here is he doesn't thank, the part where he thanks people is pretty short, but he thanks both you and your brother for your support and patience, and also thanks Moonshine for support and patience. So that makes me sound like there's some sort of story here where you had to be pretty patient about this album. Is that correct?
I mean, you had to be patient just working with Kyoki. I mean,
Seems like
he,
a fascinating dude.
you know what? He is. I mean, I haven't spoken to him in probably 15 years, maybe longer. He was he was a brilliant guy, super charming, and he was a creative genius. He was absolutely a pioneer. He was the first superstar DJ, at least in America, 100%. Um, I knew him all the way back to when he was DJing Disco 2000 at Limelight. His first mix album went out on as a Journeys by DJ in the UK, which then we released it here, and that was kind of my beginning of my relationship with him. And we worked very closely with him. We put out probably 5 mix albums, and then we put out 2 artist albums, and then 2
Ego
remix
Trip
albums.
would be the other
Yeah.
one. Yeah, which I think one of these songs that even ended up on The Simpsons. I think at some point, I believe that happened.
Yeah, I
Maybe
mean,
I'm making that.
a lot of our stuff got licensed, but and his his only problem was that he just in the end he just kind of succumbed to the indulgences that come around when you're in his position, and it sucked because talk about like a guy that had just the potential. He could still be
Right.
doing it. I mean, look, I released Carl Cox's albums in the 90s, and we sold more albums here in America than he ever sold anywhere else. um Carl's still doing it today at the tender age of 60, and at the forefront, at the top of it. And there would, Paul Oakenfold's still out there.
Right.
There's no reason why Kyoki couldn't have been that guy, other than, his own, he was his own worst enemy. And then, with respect to your question, yeah, we supported him a lot. And
Yeah.
then all of the people at Moonshine supported him a lot. And, but by the same token, we sold a lot of records with him, but he
Right.
also made a lot of money.
Yep. And it is interesting too. I referenced before that interview in the back of the like the car with Micro and Kyoki and Frankie Bones. He comes off. I thought he came off really well spoken, and he's like, you could tell that he was very thoughtful in a lot of what he said. But also, we don't have to dig up there's some sordid history of him over the years, and he seems like just that pure artist where it's like, you got to let him be who he's going to be, and it's going to be for better or for worse. It seems like somebody you're not going to have a whole lot of control over.
Amazingly intelligent, super charming. When he wasn't fucked up, just the best guy to hang out with. I mean, I toured Asia with him. I did a lot of shit with him. And when he was good, he was amazing. And when he wasn't,
Yeah.
he was just a pain in the ass to be around. And the trouble was, what happened was, the scene started getting professional. I use the quote unquote professional
Right.
in kind of the late 90s. And as much as he was a draw, he just started not showing up and being a pain in the ass. And the trouble was, he wasn't the only one out there then. In 94, 95, he was like the only guy that was literally getting flown around the country. But all these promoters were putting up good money, risking their own livelihoods, and he would not show up. I
Cardinal
mean,
sin of
I was just
performing. You
telling
got
a
to show up.
story. I was literally telling a story. I was like, literally, because we had to shepherd him on Moonshine Over America. And I remember I think we were leaving Toronto or something, and he was behind me on the gangway going onto the aeroplane. And I'm like, okay, we got him on the plane. Thank fucking God. And I sit down and he's disappeared. And they're going they're over the speaker. They're going, would Mr. Frank calling Mr. Franconi. And he'd managed to fuck off. And so,
Yeah.
anyway, I mean,
Yeah.
he was creatively fantastic. And also, as a DJ, when he was on, absolutely fucking magical. absolutely magical. Could weave just the most amazing sets together when he was on. Just brilliant.
All right, let me ask about one more. This one I was super curious about. Rock Rada. I'm a huge hip hop fan. I got the scratch poster back there. You might have noticed. Like, obviously, Rock Rada is no longer with us. R.I.P. Rock Rada. But this album's amazing. Executioners to me were a huge deal. What was putting this together like? And did you have ambitions for going further into turntablism, or hip hop in general, or was this?
Was that was that was a Moonshine album, because I know
Yep,
we did a couple of other turntablist records with Mixmag.
yep, I remember those.
Um, I think that was kind of a follow-on from the Mixmaster Mike one. With Mike, it was like, it was just a relationship thing. It was like his A&R, my A&R guy John Grauman was I think somehow got connected with Mike's, I think, wife at the time, and we just got kind of, we used to hang out with them a bit, and them, and then they got comfortable with us, because and then the idea of doing a record kind of got floated, and then the record did well despite
Yeah.
the launch and the timing. Obviously, Mixmaster Mike, the Beastie Boys. And then I think we wanted to explore it a bit more. I honestly, personally, was not that involved with that record. So, and I think it was kind of a little bit experimental for John Grauman, who was the A&R guy at the time. I don't believe it did that great. And it was one of those things where, yeah, we were trying to branch out and see what else we could do.
Mixmaster Mike, he's one of those guys that pops up everywhere. A few years, I think, after that, my friend was working at WBCN in Boston, and he was driving the promotion van. He was driving Mixmaster Mike around, and he's like, I was driving Mixmaster Mike around all night. I got you some free tickets to go see him play. I'm like, where is he playing? He's like, TD Bank Garden. I'm like, that is where the Celtics play. And he's like, he's opening for Guns N' Roses. And I was like, okay, this I got to see. So this was just Axl and Buckethead, none of the original guys. And we go there, and Mixmaster Mike goes on about an hour and a half late. And it's just him up there playing to a whole stadium full of angry Guns N' Roses fans. And it goes about as well as you would think. And then Axl doesn't go on for the rumor was he wouldn't go on until the hockey game he was watching was over. And they had to extend the trains in Boston that night. But I got to see Mixmaster Mike put an entire arena full of confused people.
Great guy. Had a lot of fun working with him. Super humble, given his background and his talent and everything. Just a wonderful guy to deal with and work with. And it was honestly like a privilege and an honor to work with him.
Yeah, one day, and I went back in my early Instagram days when I had 200 followers. He randomly liked 5 of my pictures out of nowhere, and I was just spent the next week. I'm like, how did that happen? Where did he? Because he is really, because the Beastie Boys, to me, there's almost no one bigger, and he is royalty. He is.
Yeah,
he's amazing.
Same.
Yeah.
I mean, I and it was funny because I had the kind of honor and pleasure to have a few moments like that in my career with Moonshine. And one of them was, Keoki became really good friends with Daniel Ash, and Love and Rocket's Seventh Dream of Teenage Heaven was like my summer album of high school, of my senior year of high school. And then 15 years later, I'm sitting across my desk and I got Daniel talking about, hey, I want to release some records on your label. And I'm like, if I told teenage me that this was going to happen, yeah, I would have gone, yeah, right.
I just had one of those moments where I quit rapping around 2009 because I was sitting in traffic in Boston, and I heard this song by Percy P, this rapper, and I felt so outclassed by him as a rapper. I'm like, I can't do this anymore. I'm a fraud. And just actually right now, I'm working on a song with Percy P. Now it's been 13 years, and it's like I've come full circle. I'm like, I'm no longer scared of this man. And now we're working together. And it's almost nothing feels better than that,
Yeah, that's part of, you just got to keep plugging away. That's all.
Yep. And so before we go, I looked you up online. You have something you're working on now. I want to give you a chance to mention that if that's of any interest to you.
My my kind of day job at the moment is I got pulled back into being a promoter essentially, and I'm kind of like a hired gun CMO for large events, working on Imagine Festival down in Georgia, which is an amazing show. I'm working on a platform called Amplified, and then I'll say it here, there is potentially a revival of Moonshine in another form coming, and we'll just leave it at that.
I'll be excited. That gives me now that you answered my past questions of Moonshine that I've been Googling for years, you've now given me a new one to start Googling from this day forward. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, listen, you follow me on Instagram, so you'll see what it's all about. If everything lines up right, we'll be talking in 3 or 4 months' time.
That's awesome. Well, I'll look forward to hearing that. And I thank you so much for doing this. I mean, this really, like, when I first started to come up with this idea of a podcast, I came up with a list of people that, like, I just wanted to talk to, that I thought would have interesting stories that fills in holes in my story myself. And you were top of that list. So this means a lot to me that you did this. And I really
appreciate that. And like I said to you earlier, I think in our communication, every once in a while it's fun to talk about the old times. And again, what you said to me about how Moonshine was a part of your kind of early music life, that I love hearing that, and that kind of really makes it all worth it.
Awesome. Well, it's funny. I posted the Kyoki Jealousy album on my story the other day as I was listening to it, and I post a lot of stuff that I listen to just to get conversations going and find fans that like the same stuff. I got more response to that album than I thought I ever would. People I never thought of were like, "Oh my God, that was my jam." And you're like, there still are those fans out there that miss the stuff and crave it. And I'm glad you guys did what you did.
That album, I would. I think we sold a couple of 100,000 albums. I mean, it wasn't a small release.
I guess, yeah, that is pretty big. Yeah. And that was towards the, when the scale started to dip, that was like early 2000s. That's nothing to sneeze at all,
Yeah. I mean, he sold probably combined across everything, close to 1 million albums. And that's where part, when we talk about him, we're just like, there's that should have taken, he should be still at the forefront.
Right.
But that's the music business.
It is.
But it is. I kind of watch. I don't run the Moonshine YouTube channel anymore, but for some reason I'm still connected as an admin. So whenever comments get posted on there, and the majority of the comments are for Kyoki or Cirrus, and it's exactly what you said. Like, people that I remember that record.
Can't believe I didn't get a chance to talk about them, but yeah, Cirrus was a big deal too. I know they were a big artist on your label, so definitely check them out as well.
No, they were great. They're great guys. Yeah.
So cool. All right. Thank you so much for your time, Steve. This has been an absolute pleasure, and I really appreciate it.
All right, Tim. Appreciate it too. Thank you.